So let's get into. I mean, you mentioned your opponent. Now, San
Right,
Pedro is, and the district involves more than San Pedro. I could just speak to San Pedro the best because that's where I live. But
right,
it was interesting to me when I first got here, which I'm still the new guy in town. I've only been here 4 months, but it was so interesting to me when I get to this town that it's definitely a left leaning place, which made me happy. There's a progressive newspaper in town. It's a union strong town. It's a punk rock town. And then you
right.
find out, oh, our city council person's a cop. How did this happen? How did this doesn't add up? I feel like this isn't. I'm not a fan. And he's the more I learn about him, the less I like him. And so let's get into law enforcement. You bring that up in your video. Are you for defunding the police?
Right. So it depends on what you mean, right? When you say defund the police, if you're talking about reallocating funds from police budgets into largely defunded services like city services, community services, social work, etc., then yes, I'm a huge supporter of that because for too long, our communities, our talk about defunding, our communities have been defunded, historically and presently, and there's actually a direct linkage between disinvestment from social services and an increase in law enforcement. Because unfortunately, in the city of LA, and really, it's prevalent in cities all across the country, there's more of a prioritization on policing the outcomes of economic and social um, inequality rather than actually addressing the root causes of these issues. And so, in the city of LA, for example, we have a $1.8 billion budget, $1.8 billion for the LAPD, which is about 54% of the city's general funds. So that means that things like outreach for the homeless, or even something, city services like filling potholes or putting in place stop signs, etc. Those services are largely left behind. Things like funding, um, eviction defense uh, services, that's largely defunded. And so overall, we have a problem in regards to our values, because if you look at our budget, you can really, judge a society, a government based off of how um, based off of its budgetary process. And so in our city, we prioritize policing really our way out of every situation, whether it's dealing with homelessness, instead of you know uh, prioritizing funding public housing, funding access to clean restrooms and um, services of that nature. We instead focus on um, paying police officers to displace people, basically. And that's not a solution to ending homelessness. We know that the number one cause of homelessness in LA is for both single adult individuals as well as um, families is due to lack of affordable housing. And so, spending, millions of dollars on police is not going to solve that problem. Handcuffs are not house keys. Jail cell is not a home. Um,
Well, in services not sweep to use
right.
to use the popular hashtag that Street Watch LA has popularized. Services not sweeps. It is that
Right.
simple.
Right. Simple as that. And so honestly, these issues aren't really that complicated. Um, it's our communities are underfunded, and there's huge consequences for that. People are more likely to commit, crimes out of desperation if they feel like there's no economic opportunity for them. you know and that was actually quoted by Michelle Alexander, who is a criminal rights lawyer and legal scholar, talk and author of the book The New Jim Crow, because really we are creating a caste system where um, we criminalize and traumatize folks who are poor, who are people of color, etc., while the beneficiaries of the status quo, the slumlords, and the people who benefit from the incredibly high rental market we live in right now, and um, folks who benefit from our struggles, continue to thrive, whereas everyone else continues to struggle. And as these major wealthy folks get things like in subsidies or even tax credits, etc., to gentrify our communities and invest in our communities, we get police. And so I support reimagining public safety, because not only um, do we need to invest in our communities to make sure that families are whole, but also that's also another way to keep our families safe. Um, I think we also need to rethink, um, policing in this country and certainly in our city, and focus more so on the humanitarian aspect of it. Because at the end of the day, we're talking about people. These are the people who are being separated from their families, who are being locked up, etc. These people have families, and for many folks, the difference of having food on the table, difference of um, knowing that they have a home to live in the next month can make a huge difference between um, you know going to jail or being satisfied. And so but unfortunately, and so that's also why, right, last year we saw the movement for Black Lives erupt, because when we're talking about reimagining public safety, it's not just talking about investing in communities that have been largely defunded, but it's also about holding police accountable. That's also part of the public safety components, because the key word is public, right? We the people, and we have police officers who are supposed to be sworn to protect and serve the public, the people, yet have consistently committed, you know, abused Angelinos, abused Black and Latino folks disproportionately,
That's putting it gently. I mean, yeah,
right?
absolutely.
Right, and there's countless examples of misconduct over the past, over generations. Honestly, we don't even have to look at Kentucky or Missouri to see incidents of or to seek inspiration for justice for police brutality. We can look right here in LA, where in 1965, we had the Watts riots right here in this district as a result of police brutality, as well as due to the poor conditions that folks were forced to endure. 30 years later, almost in 1992, we had the Rodney King trial, which spurred another uprising, starting in South Central LA and spreading all across the city due to another case of systemic injustice, and the continuation of the poor conditions that folks are forced to endure. So that's why last year, when our nation was really, I feel like, awakened for the first time in a long time to realities that majority of us are too familiar with, in regards to the reality of police brutality. um
Well,
even
the
in
thing
midst.
is, people entertain some fantasy that, oh, Rodney King happened and that was terrible, and then everything was fine until recently, and it's like, no, 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 nothing was ever fine, except now people are capturing it on camera because everybody has a camera on their freaking phone. That's the only thing that changed.
Right, exactly. And so, organizations like Black Lives Matter have really helped make this case even more accessible to people who may not have been aware of it before with the advancement of technology. But right, this has been going on for too long. We've been well aware of this, and there's a historical precedence here. But even still, in the midst of the pandemic, people went out to mass movements all across the country and here in Los Angeles to people from all backgrounds, Black, white, Latino, etc., to raise awareness on this issue. And I was proud to attend a protest last year in Watts, right here in my district. Um, but honestly, I was really surprised. Maybe I shouldn't have, but I was hopeful that Joe Buscino would have at least supported the $150 million cuts, which was a
He
compromise.
was one of the people who didn't.
Right. He
Yeah.
was one of two out of 15 council members to oppose that minor cut out of the $1.8 billion LAPD budget. But I guess
Ah, you're allowed to get mad about that, Brian. You're allowed to get mad.
I am mad, but um, I'm honestly not surprised because Joe
Yeah.
Buscino is a former cop, and there are many times where he's, felt so comfortable, enough that he'll even wear his uniform to city council meetings because he's such a huge advocate for his police officers. And so I wasn't surprised that he voted against it, also for the fact that he has accepted, hundreds of thousands of dollars in money from police associations, and so we can't trust him to hold his fellow police officer accountable, even if it's something as a compromise, 150 million cut out of the 1.8 billion-dollar LAPD budget. Um, and so that's why I'm running, because I'm putting people over, profit people over the interest of groups who have benefited from the status quo. Another issue in regards to this accountability, right, is that this has been going on for a long time without um, the necessary systemic changes. Police reform is not enough. We have to, go further. And I think that's why a lot of people voted in large favor of George Gascon for district attorney, for Holly Mitchell Valley County supervisor, of which I was part of that campaign. In our district, talking about how, you know, not only is our district, left leaning, but we're a pretty progressive district overall.
Mhm.
And we voted overwhelmingly in 2020 for those major changes. And so now I'm running because because the fight, hasn't stopped, just because, we got a better district attorney, or because, 45 is no longer president. We still have to make change right here in our district, because we still have people in power who are reactionaries and largely opposed to any type of major social reform that our people desperately need.
Oh yeah, and it's but I would say when you really break it down, because yeah, I mean, you have to from the seat you're sitting in, you have to be very thorough and very careful with your words where you're like, well, when I say defund the police, this is what when I say now me, I don't have to do any of that. So I can just straight up say we got to defund the police, we got to abolish the police. I can just say that and explain what I mean. You have to be very thorough in explaining what you mean, but when you really break it down what those ideas are all about, it's just common sense at this point. Yeah, it's
Right.
insane that they're getting these billions of dollars when everything else is getting left out in the cold, when investing in more social services prevents
Right.
crime in the first place. Everyone
Right.
knows this. And also, when you get into the abolish conversation, which I know, first we got to figure out the funding, then we can take the next step. But when you really think about the job of a police officer, it is absolutely beyond insane that that job even exists. It makes
Mm,
no sense. Hey, here's somebody who wasn't screened well, who wasn't trained well. Let's give them a gun and they can just respond to any problem. What could possibly go wrong here? Oh, by the way, they might be in the KKK because we don't
mm,
screen for shit. I don't see any
mm.
problems here. This will go great. No, it won't go great. It'll go terribly. And it has for decades and decades and decades. So it's time to, I think this is what you said in your video. We need to reimagine what law enforcement is and the role it plays in our lives. I'm not advocating that we have no law enforcement whatsoever. People say, oh, so you just, when something happens, there's no one you could call, blah, blah, blah. When you call the cops, what help are they anyway, most of the time, first of all? And second of all, no, that's not what we're calling for. We're calling for a better law enforcement system in our lives, which, if we came up with something completely new, there's no way it'd be worse.
Right. Can I quickly touch on that? Because I think you really hit the point there in regards to, um, the fact that these police officers, they are armed, right? They are trained, are supposed to be trained to deal with violent cases. I do think we do need, folks to deal with violent crime, but um, there are so many cases where having a police officer, just having someone with a firearm, is not only inappropriate but also dangerous. When it comes to responding to folks who are experiencing homelessness, what we need to prioritize is, like you mentioned before, outreach services, homelessness services, helping people get connected to resources, to permanent housing. Because what ends up happening when you um, use police officers as the first response to homelessness is you have increased, rates of force. And as a result, 1 out of every 3 use of force in Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles, regarding a police officer involves an unhoused Angelino. And, right. And
Yeah.
that's tragic because it's a traumatizing event, and it makes it even harder to connect folks to housing because when they see a uniform the next time, it's triggering. They're less likely to trust, the government, since we've violated, the trust ourselves by, um, abusing them when all they needed or wanted was help. And so you can really judge a society on how it treats its most vulnerable members of the community. And we need to reimagine how we address situations that aren't violent, whether it's a mental health crisis, homelessness crisis, or even, traffic stops or even car crashes. Maybe it's unnecessary to have, armed, well-equipped armed police officer who, in a matter of, seconds, can end someone's life or, injure someone. So those are, really serious, and there are many cases all across the country where people, where there's like in DC, can't remember the person's name, but they called the police because their child was having mental health crisis. They didn't know who else to call, so they called 911, and eventually, the child got shot. Um, and it made headlines, and there's a lot of these cases um that don't make the headlines, or don't aren't hashtags, um and just because it's not trending anymore, or there's not mass movements, people protesting all across the streets all across the country right now, doesn't mean that these crises aren't happening. And so these issues are very urgent, so that's why I'm running now, because we can't afford to wait 4 more years for the next case to happen. We need to really change our system immediately.
Oh, absolutely. And you're very good at the diplomacy, by the way. I gotta tip my hat to you. You're very good. You're very good at just putting it in a very where I'm over here and I'm like, these fucks, and you're just like, yeah, it's not. You're doing good. You're doing good.
Thank you.
Get your news on with Ron. Don't you wanna know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Get your news on with Ron. Don't you wanna know what's going on? We're getting our news on today. Yeah, yeah, yeah. You can tweet me an article at Ron Placone. We'll go through it together and make it our own. Get your news on with Ron.